Welcome to a special edition of the Darden Admissions Podcast. I'm your host, Brett Twitty, and you are listening to a new episode. On this episode of the podcast, I'm excited to share my recent conversation with Gerry Yemen. Gerry is Senior Researcher and Executive Director for the Darden Case Writing Research Group, and she has interviewed protagonists and written or co-authored over 400 cases, teaching notes, and technical notes during her time here at Darden. If you have ever wondered how a case comes together, this episode is essential listening. So without further ado, here's my interview with Gerry Yemen. Gerry, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you. I'm eager to have a conversation with you about case writing.
It's great to have you here. So we were talking before we got started, and there's some misconceptions about what case writers do or what case writing is and what it looks like. And I'm excited to learn myself. I will admit, I scheduled this conversation partly for my own education, but I have no doubt that our listeners are also interested in what goes into writing a case. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, I'm happy to answer any questions and sort of share, how, and I will literally call it how the sausage is made. I'm happy to share my experiences.
Well, before we get into all of that, how are things going for you? How are you doing?
Excellent. We have had, I would say, a lot of that, in which we will probably get into later, is that the growth of my team has really helped, with our case writing. So we are producing more and more cases, and just interesting. Cases have always been interesting, but I really have to say that things are going well for me because I have so many talented folks that I work with.
Yeah, I can only imagine, working with the faculty and where all these cases come from and sort of writing them and publishing, put them out to the world, and they get used. Certainly at Darden, they get used at other business schools. And so folks know, if they know something about the Darden academic experience, they've likely heard that we're case method schools, kind of student-centered discussion learning. So let's start, before we even get to all of that, let's talk a little bit more about you. So tell us who you are and what's your background.
I'd rather talk about cases than me. So actually, interesting enough, my background is in political science. So I'm not a writer by trade or by education. And before that, before I went back to school, I was a nurse. And so I had like a couple different paths that one would never connect with case writing, case research. But they actually both really help, because one part that you were always taught as a nurse is to listen. And that's really important as a case researcher. And the other part is, I studied political science and I looked at voting behavior. And so it was a quant-driven, education. And so that really translated well when you think about, business school case studies and different functional areas and, preparing materials for these.
And where's home for you originally?
So I'm from I'm from Canada, but even Canadians laugh when I tell them where I'm from. So I was born in a place called Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, Canada. So that's it's up north, really up north. And I wouldn't say that it's, people get an idea that perhaps I came from a real, there was real seclusion, but it's not that you're secluded. It's just that the elements are harsh and there aren't a lot of people. But we just live a little differently because of that. And I always, now that I go home, having lived in Virginia for many, many years, it's really a challenge, because I'm used to the harsh element. And I know my life's easier because I live in a warm climate. That's kind of fun.
Well, I will share, you may know this already, I'm going to put this together. You're our first guest from Saskatchewan here on the podcast. So that's very exciting. So I'm sure our listeners are wondering, how do you get from Saskatchewan to Charlottesville? How does that happen?
Yeah, so that actually was my spouse. So he actually, I always tell people I'm married to a Southerner because he's from Regina, which is the capital of Saskatchewan. And it's about, 60 miles north of North Dakota. So it's most Canadians most of our cities actually are closer to the U.S. border. So I tell people I'm married to a Southerner. But it was he always wanted to go to Harvard. And, from a kid from Saskatchewan at that time, that was kind of challenging. But I just remember saying to him, we can do this. We already had a couple kids. I was going, well, you can figure this out. You're a smart guy. So we ended up, that was the pathway. So he ended up going to Harvard and then going on faculty there. And then he was invited to come to the University of Virginia. And there was kind of it's kind of an interesting path because I did not want to leave Boston. I thought it was warm and really kind of an interesting place. But I was told some advice that I just really, one time when I was visiting with him and I did not want to come. And this very clever and smart, gentle physician said to me, sometimes opportunities come along and you need to know when to recognize them. And I was young and I took that to heart. I mean, at the time, I think I was like 29 or something, 27, 29. I took that to heart because I was going to block this. I was not moving from Boston. And in retrospect, it was great because look, I ended up here, case writing.
All right. So we're following your journey from Saskatchewan to Boston to Charlottesville. So how do you get to Darden specifically?
Yeah, let's get really to the good part is how do I get to Darden? So I'm sitting down. There used to be a donut shop down on Barracks Road at the bottom of the hill. And this was a fairly new building at the time. And on grounds, people referred to it as Versailles. And there was an ad. We're having coffee with some friends, and there was an ad in it was, I believe it might have even been Seaville Weekly, which at the time was considered an underground paper. It was quite, for that time period, it was, and there was an ad for a diversity case writer at the Darden School of Business. And I saw this and I was asking my friends, so what do you think this is all about? And because I studied, race and in voting behavior, I was this idea of, diversity at the business school. What does that mean? What's a case? And again, I thought case was empirical methods, N equals 1, right? So I had a different view of what a case might be. I had no idea what a business case study was. And I came up here and the first person I met, there was a receptionist who was incredibly warm and inviting. And she just said, help yourself to a cup of coffee. My friends had all laughed at me to think that, oh, what would they do with you up there? I mean, it was really just kind of, well, I'm going to see what this is. And Lily Powell believe at the time, the dean was Ted Snyder. And I believe that she had some funding to look at diversity in cases. And this is 1998. And what they wanted to look at was how could the school, I shouldn't say we because I wasn't part of the school then, but how could the school increase, one, where was the case collection in terms of diversity? And two, how could the school make efforts to add some inclusion in the case studies? Because at the time, most of the case studies, nobody knew what sort of the demographics or anything were of them at the time. And so she started this initiative and it was funded. And so I was hired, I can't believe it, but I was actually hired to look at, just had a wonderful welcoming conversation with Lily and then, applied for the job and landed it. And it was 20 hours a week. So I read the case collection and our definition of diversity was really broad. So me being a Canadian was diverse. Because we were just trying to, anything that wasn't an American, company, so a Canadian company, it was really kind of interesting how we were just trying to find some difference. And of course, then that rule changed a little bit. And it was kind of an experiment too, because think up to this time, a lot of faculty had written all their own cases. And there was that expectation that they write them, that they do the research, and take on everything about their cases. Well, you can imagine, that's okay. Can somebody from the outside come in and support this effort? So that's what I did, and I walked around and tried to find out people like, okay, what is case writing? How does this work? And there wasn't really a clear path. It was, well, faculty had some research funds and they would hire somebody in their functional area to help them with this. And that's exactly what it went. And we didn't have Darden Business Publishing. It was called the Darden Case Collection, which was really just a library of, cases that faculty had written over the years. And so that's how it all started.
That's so interesting. So it's something of like a novel role that you walked into, right? The faculty trying to figure out how you can be helpful to faculty who have largely worked on this on their own. That seems potentially challenging.
Yeah. So, well, and eventually what my mission was to write cross-functional across every functional area. And that faced its own challenges because it's not like I'd ever worked in a business outside of a hospital in my nursing career. And then I went back to school, and my area, graduate school was political science. And so it was like, okay, what could I see? Well, economics, I can see. Economics, I was fine because back in the day, economics and political science were very closely related. And there was, the rational choice voter, there's a rational market. I mean, there were just language things that I had. But there was something that was even more interesting that evolved was that my office was in the library. And so the librarians, and Karen Marsh was the reference librarian at the time, and she went on to become director of the library before Tom, who's there now. But I went out to her and I said, okay, you need to show me, where do I find things about the stock market? Where do I find, how do I find, and I just, would spend any time in between what I was supposed to be doing, which is, helping write some cases, was, okay, I need to understand what they're teaching. And all these materials that were on reserve, I started reading everything that the students had to read. And I read the case collection, every single case that they had at the time, and their teaching notes, because I had the first action item was that I would look to see at the level of diversity of our cases and put it together in a spreadsheet. So that, when it came down to writing cases, though, you bring up a really valid point. I had no expertise whatsoever. And I relied on a lot of people to help me.
Maybe a little bit of an unfair question, but do you remember the first case you worked on?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And interesting enough, I then went to one of the first cases I wrote. So I wrote 3 at a time because, case writing is, as a case researcher, you have deadlines, people want these in their classroom, and you have opportunities to interview, company executives, or really, people just practitioners, not just executives. And so it's when they are available, you have to be available. So I remember a couple of my first cases, and at one point, this one it clearly just read like a B level novel. It was just so terrible. And I remember the professor reading it, and I describe this. I'm setting the setting, the dark and stormy night, the opening paragraph, and this thing is, a teardrop table in the conference room, and it was actually about an acquisition, right? But I have this, the protagonist, which was a female, and she's in this, stark white shirt and looking all corrected. It was just awful. And the professor reads it and says, okay, so you need to learn something about how to write these cases. And I said, well, I just was trying to bring the reader in because I read the collection and there's some pretty boring openings and they're all the same. So I was trying to make them different. And I went to a case writing workshop. It was like, okay, I got to learn how to do this. So Harvard didn't offer them, and they still actually, interesting enough, don't offer case writing workshops for the public, but Ivy up in Ontario did. So I went back to Canada and I went to this and learned how to case write and had this conversation because of opening section that they assigned you. You had to interview an Ivy grad and develop a case throughout the week. And part of their opening introduction about sections of cases was, okay, well, you do have to have there are 6 things that need to be in every opening case. And I had no idea that they did. You have to have, the reader needs to know, students really, they need to know the company, they need to know the location, they need to know who the protagonist's name. There has to be some time frame considered. Geopolitical things change. Where are we at? I mean, and so there's these list of things, and you had 60 words at Ivy to come up with your opening section. Well, I couldn't write anything at that time in 60 words and have such an inviting opening section that I thought was required. And having this discussion with this professor that was running the workshop and him just laughing. So I showed him the opening section to that case I described on the acquisition. And he just started laughing. And I said, well, why don't you, because they use an example. They show you an example of one that's not well written. I said, why don't you guys just use that from now on? So they used that in their workshops. I gave them permission to use it for what not to do. So they plaster it up there. And then when I went on to teach case writing workshops, I always threw that up there first and say, okay, so how did this one work, right? Like, after you introduce what really should be in an opening section, then I'll throw this up on a whiteboard or something and go, okay, so what do you think about this one? How does it sit with, and people are so busy looking for the date and all these other things, but you will hear some giggles because I generally ask somebody to read it aloud, and it is pretty funny. It's pretty bad. So it's a huge learning curve in case research. Writing, nobody can write a perfect sentence ever to start. And this idea that, I have to say that my writing skills improved, but I needed to know how to write a case. And then the other thing that becomes very apparent is that each functional area has cases are different. So how you structure them, how you think about them, they're different. But that was my start. And yeah, they were pretty embarrassing. And I would say that so I have a really good relationship with my counterpart at Harvard. And people think that we are competitors, and we're not. She's my mentor. She just embraced me. I went up to Harvard and spent time with them, and just she's the one who really helped guide me and really helped set up the Darden Case Writing Research Group. Because without her helping me and guiding me, I wouldn't have known what I needed and how to go about creating what we did.
Let's talk a little bit about the life cycle of how a case comes together. Hopefully this sounds like a fair question, because it's one thing I can say I don't really know much about. I've read the end product, and it's funny to hear you mention the first 60 words, the intro, what you have to accomplish. I've always been struck by they have, in some ways, a similar structure. They kind of say these things, and that makes total sense. If you have 6 key things that you have to communicate, it makes sense that there'd be similar structures.
Right. And, and the structure of cases are really, I mean, they're very deliberate and they're very strategic. And they are developed, a lot of them with the functional area in mind, and also with the level of student, right? So a second year case might be a little more challenging than a first year case, right? So I might, and even in the graphics, you might put something in the graphics that, that you would tie them together for an introductory class. And the graphic would show, maybe you were showing general administrative costs, and as that was happening, that it was having a percentage of the revenues. It was having an effect on the revenues, right? If you were in a more advanced level of the class, or a deeper, perhaps it's it's going to be taught near the end of a first year course or even in a second year elective, you might not make that connection for students. You would just put the data together, and then they would have to draw it through the chart and go, there's something going on with the general administrative costs here, and then figure it out, right? So, and it depends on what the professor wants to teach. So cases are all driven by the professors. I can't write you a case because I'm not an expert in business unless I know what you want to teach. And so that's how cases start, is you have to have teaching objectives. A lot of times cases will, people will think, and it happens, and we all will do it, is, oh, I just met this practitioner, this would be a really good case. And then you write it, and then you try to figure out how to teach it. And that is probably the least effective way to use your time to start. And the other thing that happens is that we are not the only people who write cases at Darden. So professors have two options. Really, they have three options. One is to write their own, and there are some professors who still will write all their own materials. The other option is they have research funds and they can hire whoever they want. Maybe it's a PhD student, maybe it's sometimes for summer help, they'll hire Darden students, or maybe it's a research assistant they have for their research, and they ask them to do some case writing. So there's that avenue. And then there's the Darden Case Writing Research Group, which I'm in, and it is, this is all we do, is case writing or case research. And how that starts with us is usually sometimes they come to the door, sometimes they yell up. I leave my window open in my office, they'll yell, "Hey, Gerry, yeah, got a case for you," right? Or, "Hey, can I talk to you?" Or it's really the creativity and innovation in this place comes from our professors and their ideas, right? And so they are so, I have to say, they're so excited about what they want to put in their classrooms. But it's always tied to the learning, right? So it might be they have an idea, but they haven't reached out to a protagonist. They haven't looked up necessarily the research yet, or those kind of things, but they have these amazing ideas, or they have gaps in their curriculum or there's something that comes along that they really want to teach. And then they'll show up and they'll say, "These are my ideas. This is what I want to teach." And, and then we will brainstorm. There's 6 in my group. There's the 6 of us, and each one of us has a different functional area expertise. And we also have some cross-functional expertise, but finance is a huge, it takes me forever to write a finance case. I mean, I had to in the beginning because it was me, but they were not nearly as good. They took me forever. Professors were so patient, but I now have, actually three case researchers who are all really amazing in finance and accounting. And so I would never have to write those cases anymore. But anyhow, so it depends on who you assign, but we will have our Monday morning meeting and go, "Hey, does anybody know?" So here's an example we just had this week, maybe it was last week, but it's just an example of a professor was looking for a case about idea theft. And I hope that I don't think I'm revealing anything to any students here on this one. But okay, so then what are some ideas? And professor came with these what they wanted to teach. And so, we kind of brainstormed. Does anyone have connections here? Does anyone know anything like this? Or, another example would be companies. There was one on looking for a company that had sort of the Patagonia model of being very political and socially active with their brand, but everybody uses Patagonia, okay, or everybody uses Starbucks, so could we go outside and think of something else? And we came up with this company, one in Germany and one in China, right? And it was just by our own experiences and some connections that we reach out to. And the other thing about these ideas of where we get ideas for cases is within Darden. There isn't anybody in this organization that doesn't touch on case writing. I reach out to, whether there's people that, like, I'm thinking that people in engagement, in the creatives that are in the, that run the technology at Darden. It's James, it's people that work in the kitchen, it's people, I reach out to them all the time. Okay, how does this work? Do you have any ideas of this? How would this, right? Because everybody has this love of cases because they're at Darden. All right, now that's just a gimme, which I found kind of interesting when I got here. Is everybody loves them, and nobody ever says no. Even though I'm calling and I want something from them, it's not like I can ever help you do anything, right? But I'm always asking, or someone from my group is always asking. And so everybody here has some input to the case writing, to how cases are developed. It's incredible. And now I've digressed because I can't remember what I was going on, other than this is how they start, is, ideas.
All right. So you've got an idea, you got a teaching objective, an idea, maybe you've developed some companies. Do you then reach out to the companies and say, hey, we're from the Darden School. Would you be interested in being part of a case?
Yes. Yeah. Some of us are more comfortable as case researchers. We're more comfortable reaching out to folks. I have no problem picking up the phone, and the finance guys have no problem picking up the phone because they were all in, private equity and things, and they're used to calling companies and asking. And I don't know, I guess my background, I'm just, it's people generally like to help, and there's ways around it. Like, you can reach out to other people. So I was somebody in Darden who just gave us an amazing contact that I was really hoping to get. And the case is supposed to be taught in Q4, which is coming up in a few weeks. And I haven't even started it because I couldn't get a hold of who we were hoping would be the protagonist. Somebody in Darden had a relationship and just connected me. So away we go. So yeah, you reach out to companies. Not everybody understands. So we generally start with the University of Virginia because not everybody understands Darden or cases or know Darden. And for the most part, I've had some failures, and I've had some fun. Oh my gosh, I had a great, we didn't have, this is several years ago, and as I think about this, we probably still don't have many cases on unions. Well, for global, we're now much more global, and a lot of areas of the world, you have to know relationship building and unions and how they function, and what as a manager that means to you. So trying to get this union case several years ago, it was for Erica James, I'll tell you that, because she was so much fun. And I don't know, it's an interesting story. It's kind of fun. So I, reach out to he's actually the president of the United Steelworkers of America at the time. And I reach out and have difficulty. I use my Darden contact, not thinking that, oh, this is a union. And management is not probably something that they're still all that willing to help necessarily, but it didn't occur to me at the time. And so I do get through to his executive assistant, and we have a fairly decent conversation till I tell her that I'm at a business school and I'm looking for some help and would like to speak to the president. And Leo Gerard was his name, and I can share all this because it's published, and he signed the release, and he would come to Darden. But it was pretty funny because she was not going to help eventually. And I went, oh, who is this guy? And I look more at him. It turns out he's a Canadian. And it turns out that he was from Ontario, and he started a lot of his speeches with, he was the son of a union coal miner in Sudbury, Ontario. And so you can figure out anybody's email if you have somebody else's. And I had his assistants send him an email. How about the son of a coal miner's, knowing I might not get this, I was a little more asked Erica, is it okay if I just throw out this email and see, it's not the usual way. I had sent a zillion emails that were really polite of what I was looking for. But this time I just threw this out, and she said, sure. And so I said, how about the son of a union coal miner from Sudbury, Ontario? At least have the courtesy to reply to the daughter of a union railroader from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, because I went to school in Saskatoon, so he would know Saskatoon. And it was like, I don't know, maybe about 15 minutes later or something, my phone rings in my office and I pick it up, and I'm used to people being very polite on the phone. It was this big booming voice. What's all this bump about a union railroader's daughter from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan? So I knew immediately who it was. And when I get nervous, I laugh, as you could probably tell through this interview. But I'm laughing, right? And I go, that's not that. I said, I'm actually, from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And he said, I don't give a where you're from. Are you the daughter of a union railroader? And I said, yes, I am. My dad helped establish BRAC. And I said, as a kid, I went to the picket line with him. Oh, well, it's really nice to meet you. I'm Leo Gerard, president of the United Steelworkers of America. How can I help you? And so then I explained what I wanted. And I said, and then the professor is Erica James. And he goes, wait. Is she the daughter of a union railroader from Sass? I said, hang on a minute. Her office is just down from mine. I ran out of my office to Erica's. Any union connections? And she goes, well, my grandfather was a Pullman porter. I come back on, grab the phone. I said, does a Pullman porter work? And he went, she's in. So he came to Darden. We did the case. He came to Darden, and he walked into the classroom, and he has this really beautiful suit on, and he's a very striking, a very he had a presence. He takes his jacket off, rolls up his sleeves, and says, "So this is what a group of budding capitalists looks like." And it was on. And the great part about the whole discussion was that he never used the word union. He always used the word labor movement. And then he was a friend of the school for several years. He would come when they taught the case. But yeah, so cases you never know.
All right. So you go and you talk with folks at the company. I mean, so that's one example. I mean, what's it like to go and visit? Let's say the person's open to being a protagonist. I imagine maybe not everybody is, but you finally get someone who is open to that. What's it like to go and interview them?
Well, that's fascinating. There's a lot of work you have to do up front because you never want to ask questions that you can find publicly. What we really need to know is the why. And then not all cases are field-based cases. There's some functional areas, particularly where companies don't want to talk about their, about some of their challenges or issues. And remember, we're always looking for practitioners' experiences where they struggle, right? And so it's not like this is a best practice all the time. It's just, okay, well, a reasonable person could make a decision given several options, which is what really managers have to do all the time. And you just are trying to make a reasonable choice based on the frameworks that professors help you unfold in their classrooms, right? So, the public source cases, we'll talk about that just for a second, and those are either library-based cases or public source cases, are value because you have a greater ability to sort of pick and choose what you're going to put into a case in terms of what you can have the students sort of think about, right? So there's value in those cases, but quite often I will send those cases to a company. In fact, the ones that I write, I generally try, and most people in my group, to send them to the company because they will often give us a quote or, a correction, or because it's hard to write things from public sources because we don't know the whole story. Whereas the practitioner, the field-based case where you go to the company, well, that's exactly on what they tell you it is, because it's their experience. It's what that practitioner and the people around them experience. So yeah, I would have to say it's been one of the most fascinating things if you think about it, I've been here since 98. One of the most fascinating things, I've met so many people around the world. Because our cases, I've interviewed people in China, I've been to Saudi Arabia, you name it, I've been around the world interviewing at different organizations. And it is one of the most fascinating things about the job. And of course, you have to keep everything confidential. And so I can't even talk about all the fascinating things where you maybe you feel like you fell short, or maybe you feel like you did really well and then things didn't turn out right. Just having somebody there where it's confidential is really kind of an interesting part. I learn a lot.
I imagine that sort of confidential nature allows people to be more open with you. At least I would think so.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's distinguishing, and that's one of the reasons why the title is case researcher, not case writer, because companies equate that with journalists, where they don't control. So we have releases that we have to have signed, and anything that you tell me is confidential, and it's held confidential. Now, most people will allow me to use a recorder over the years, and I promise to get rid of it to the extent that you can. You delete them, but um, I suppose somebody could always technology, right? But yeah, it's a real trust relationship. And I'm so grateful to all, and this is even our students and other people in business who aren't from case method, just how much they're willing to give to management education by talking to us.
And so you gathered this information, whether it's sort of public source or private sourced information, and then how long does it take to form into? I mean, is the shape of the case obvious as you start to have these conversations? I mean, what's the next step in the process?
Yeah, so you actually start writing your case even before. This is how I teach, and actually even I think almost everybody in my group has a similar approach. Is you start writing the case before, right? Because you have to do an industry and company background before you even show up to know what they do, right? Because again, you don't want to be asking any questions that you can find publicly. So we start writing that right away. So people say, well, do you ever have, do you ever see this blank sheet of paper and go, oh, how am I going to get started? I never have writer's block. Well, for a couple of reasons. One, you always got somebody hitting you upside the head going, look, I need that next week. I'm going to teach that, right? Or the editors say, are you going to get this to us before it gets taught? Which quite often doesn't when it's a new case. We just don't have the bandwidth, the time. And they're living, breathing things, so we tend to refine them after it's been taught the first time. But yeah, you start there sort of again, it's like if you students who or those who have read a lot of cases or about to read a lot of cases will see that there's a structure to most of them. And a lot of that structure we write beforehand. The company, it goes from the broad information to the narrower. And then it's a narrower information that we get. So it's what's specific to the challenge to the case, right? What we would describe as sort of the tension to the case. Okay, so there's a decision that has to be made at some point. And so any information about that decision is what we generally get from the companies. And so you start slogging through your interview notes. And yes, I still take notes, although I started showing up a little sharper a few years ago because I went to a tech company and it was out in California, and I show up with my old recorder and a notebook, and the CFO started making fun of me going, come on, you look like you crawled out of the Ivy Tower with a notebook. I haven't seen one of those in years, right? So I ended up getting everybody iPro so that we have I still take notes, but this time it's better with it has the tech pen and it's on the iPro. And you can record at the same time, and you don't even have to take notes because it will, now digitally get you the words. So we have advanced, but it really is like going through all those again. So where does that fit in the case? All right. So where would I put that? One, to have students, a reasonable person, go down this way or this path, right? Who do I put here? What do I put here? And it really is a strategic what fits and what doesn't. And what do they have to know and what don't they have to know, right? Because length of cases is sometimes an issue.
Yeah, my impression of Darden cases is that they are shorter. Not always, but that there's like an economy to them. At least the ones that I've seen.
It's interesting because I would walk to work when I first started, and I would go through the path where the students walked. And I started asking them, so what makes a good case, right? Because remember, and sometimes they'd be law students because I didn't know, they're all walking to the same place, a similar place, right? And so sometimes I get an answer from a law student, and so then I go, oh, in my mind, okay, that's a law student. But the business students would, oh, number one, short. That was in my non-scientific asking around, what was the best? A short one. So yeah, I think that our cases tend to be a little more succinct. Um, maybe, maybe, and I do hear there is a difference between, and I know because I have a Harvard, Aldo, one of our case researchers, spent 20 years at working for Karen at Harvard. So, and he's with me now, and Karen still talks to me. But he's, his writing style is a little bit different, and he has said how much he's enjoyed. There is a difference in the cases, and how faculty think about, not necessarily think about their cases, but how they do tend to be a little less concise sometimes, as well as shorter.
So I imagine as you're pulling the case together, you're thinking about the structure where information can be added in. There's a sort of ongoing dialogue with the faculty member. At least I assume that there is.
So that depends on the faculty member, and it depends on the experience of the case researcher. So for those of us, so there's three of us, between the three of us, we probably have like, let's see, I got 25, all 50, 60. We probably have about 70 years of experience writing cases between the three of us. And so there's very little that a professor has to do other than they read the first draft. We do have conversations, going along, right? Just make sure that we're going to go down a direction that the professor envisions is fine. And so you have meetings, and you have a meeting and throw all this together. And then it's really the first draft. So we have several drafts. Okay. And that's the other thing is, you don't write a single draft. Some of them I will write, before I even send it to a professor, I've written 6 drafts of myself. Right. So yeah, it's writing and writing and writing, and it's a process. So if you read my first draft, you couldn't make sense of it because I've combined my research notes from public sources, and I've combined what I learned from the company. And, just one of the things you always have to think about is you don't ever want to plagiarize. So one of the ways of getting around that, and this is probably a really good piece of information for anyone who wants to write, is anything that I write from public sources, I always put the citation right there, but I never write what the sentence said or what the paragraph, if they're using something, so just an example this morning on cloud ERP. Well, there seems to be, there's this distinction between the cloud ERP there's a, one that's about a product and one that's about for services. And so I use a citation, but I don't use all those words. I only have like 2 words, product and service ERP, and then I cite them. And that way, then it forces me to write my own when I get to that point where I'm actually writing paragraphs on certain things and connecting ideas and things from public sources and things from what the company says, right? That's when you put these things together and add more words. But yeah, it's really a craft. You end up doing most of that as a case researcher. You send your first draft, which from our group is pretty solid, pretty nice. Because even my new case researchers, and by new, I mean, I have case researchers that have been here for a couple of years, but they still are teamed up with one of us, the 3 that have been writing for a long time or doing this for a long time because it's such a huge learning curve. And then you send it to the professor, and you go from there. And yes, I think this will work. Yes, it won't. It goes to the classroom. That's always really exciting because all our materials go into the classroom. We do not write a single thing that does not hit a Darden classroom. We just don't have the bandwidth. It would be nice if we could write cases for seeds of faculty's research. And I think that may come at some point, but we just don't have the bandwidth in our group to do that at this point. But yeah, it goes to the classroom. Well, what if it doesn't sing? right? What if there's like, it just doesn't do what the professor was hoping? Do we throw it out? What do we do?
What's that like to hear back from the faculty member, or maybe even see class discussion and find that the case really works, that there's a really great discussion and it accomplishes the teaching objective?
Yeah, so we always watch because we have to write a teaching note. Okay, so every case should have a teaching note. And it's not for our professors because they already, they develop the teaching note. They've developed their teaching plan. They know what they want to teach and how they want to unfold it. And they will experiment with that too, right? Because case method is the questions you ask in class can make or break it, right? So it can derail a discussion. And sometimes it's not the professor asking the question, it's the student. So, I just have such respect. I just, these these maestros and professors, how it all falls together. But yeah, so we always either, we used to always be in the classroom. Sometimes, COVID changed that a little bit, but quite often we still are in the classroom because you get a better view of where things might have struggled or where students need more clarification or things that come up that you hadn't thought about. And a lot of that goes into sort of a teaching note, and this for other people who buy the cases that may not be as seasoned at teaching case method as our professors are. And yeah, and sometimes you just sit there and you just go, these students are just so amazing. They're so brilliant. And then other times you go, wait a minute, I thought that was so important and that's why I put that in there. How come nobody jumped on that? And then you realize, well, because it just didn't matter, right? Because our students have business experience, right? There's this knowledge in the room of students. And sometimes you get ideas from that. And so you go back to the professor or they'll come to your office and we debrief and go, that they really stumbled on that. And that was really part of the learning. They were, the professors were really pleased that there was some trying to figure this out, right? And then there's other times when you just go, no, and the professor will say, you know what, that's not how I want this to unfold. And that's when you don't feel so great because you sort of feel like you were responsible for that. But the great part about this whole process is they'll try to teach it more, right? Like I'll make some revisions or, someone else in the group will make some revisions. They go back in there with the same thing that they knew didn't work at the time, but some changes, maybe this works because they're not giving up on it, right? So it's really, yeah, it's really quite fascinating. It is fun.
Also, from the realm of maybe unknowable questions, do you have a sense of how many cases you've been a part of during your time at Darden since '98?
Oh boy. Okay. So maybe about 8 years ago, 7 or 8 years ago, I had 400. Now that is cases and technical notes. And there might be a couple exercises in there, but they get archived, right? They get retired. Some never even made the transition to Darden Business Publishing because they get old. They're not used anymore. Nobody buys them. Well, if they're not used at Darden, and then if nobody buys them through what became Darden Business Publishing, then they disappear. So that was, I can't really tell. On average, 25, 30 a year, 20, and then it depends too, because some functional areas you can write cases in less time, right? Because all that we really need is a practitioner. I'm thinking of, there's some functional areas where it's easier to write because it's shorter. So it's almost like a 3 or 4 3-page case. It doesn't take a lot of background. You don't need that to teach a concept, right? Or unfold a framework. Others really require a lot of work and thought, so cryptocurrency there's an example. I mean, it's such a complex thing. So there's some things that are just extraordinarily complex that you really have, so students can have a grasp at it. You really have to dig in on that. So that takes longer.
Still 25, 30 cases a year is incredible. I wonder, probably also a little unfair, do you have a favorite case or something that you worked on recently that you just really, really loved?
Oh, Brett, they're all my favorite babies. The only ones I don't are the dogs that don't work in the class. And I mean, and that's the extraordinary thing about it, right? Because if you come and say to me, "Oh, I need a case on, well, okay, so an ERP system." I mean, it just sounds so clunky. And I'd written one several years ago, and I just remember really enjoying the company. And I didn't know what an ERP system was. And so ERP is enterprise resource planning. And it's all now digital and things. And I was just going, oh, thanks. And now writing one that is digitalized, writing, update. Students still need to know because they are considered the backbone of many, many businesses. And so it's changed. So writing about that has been fascinating because I went, oh, wow, I had no idea. Right. Of course, I have no idea about any of these things. But and it's kind of fun too so we, of course, data science is huge and data analytics is huge. So we have a data scientist on the case research team group within our group. And so his materials, we all read everything that he works on, because I've learned about digital twins are neural networks, all these words, and I don't know anything about it, but I know what the words mean now, right? Because of what my other my colleagues in my group are working on. So yeah, we read each other's cases and technical notes and teaching notes so that we can stay current. So we know. So they're all my favorites, but I suppose everybody else's are more favorite than mine. I like their work better.
I love that idea about the constant learning, constantly, learning from your colleagues and staying engaged. And I mean, obviously business is always changing. And so that's coming into your work. I just have to imagine all the work that goes into that. Such a payoff to get to see the discussion. I mean, that's what the case is about, right? It's not just to write it, it's to see it as a teaching tool.
It is. And it's exciting to see what the faculty do with like, you have no idea that's how it's gonna, because I don't understand what they know and their theoretical models and frameworks and those kind of things. So it's, they give the guidance and things, but when I see what they do with it, that's never disappointing. And of course, as you can imagine, yeah, I mean, I've been going to business school for almost 25 years now because I get to see all these cases. So I've been a student, really.
So a couple more questions for you, Gerry, as we wrap up here. Given all the work that you've done on case development here at the Darden School, do you have any advice for students about learning through the case method? You've seen a lot of classes. You've been going to business school for 25 years, as you've noted.
Read them.
It's a fair point.
Well, I know, students get busy. They have a lot of reading, but there is value to reading it. I think that what I would share is that, one, our students are so good to always, they will answer when I'm looking for case protagonists. They know what I need, and if they can't help me, they will find someone in their organization or someone outside their organization. So when you're reading those cases, you can sometimes think, when you're in the real world, and go, I'm a business case study. I am exactly what, this would be really good in the classroom. Reach out to us. Let us know. Instead of me, sometimes, I might not reach out to you, right? But every year I have students that come to find me, seek me out. And I don't know how they know how to, but they will, and they find me. Maybe they just see me walking in. I don't know. But and so just for students and reading the cases in terms of what students will always come back to me and say was, I had no idea at the time that case, because they'll remember the cases, they'll remember the company, they will remember an issue. And then when they find themselves relating to that, sometimes I'll even get, an email or a call or something going, so there was this case. Can you send that to me? I want to share it with my team, or, things like that. It's really kind of interesting. So the cases will stick with you.
That I've definitely heard from alums, and it makes sense, right? Because you have this whole story of this narrative structure around something that you learned, and you had a whole discussion about it, by the way. So much of this makes it sticky. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. What a treat it was to learn more about how a case comes together. I learned so much through this conversation, Gerry. Thank you for doing this.
Well, thanks for having me.
And that was my interview with Gerry Yemen, Senior Researcher and Executive Director of the Darden Case Writing and Research Group here at the Darden School of Business. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, anything you'd like for us to cover here on the podcast, we're all ears. We can be reached at Darden, that's DARDEN, @virginia.edu. Until next time, stay safe, be well, and thanks for listening.